Evening, everyone. Today is 30th of January, 2025, and a warm welcome to the Empowerment Through Transparency session focused on utility companies. I'm Sapphire Carrington, and we're thrilled to have you here. We have a short agenda for tonight. We're going to have a brief introduction. We're going to talk about a balancing act with the utility suppliers, the consumer perspective, which should take about 15 minutes. Understanding consumer dilemmas, which is a case study which we actually just swapped, and we'll be doing that first, correct? Increasing capacity for activity, that is 35 minutes. We'll provide some key tips and takeaways, and that'll be 5 minutes, and there'll be some closing remarks and a vote of thanks.
A call for consumer protection on utility services. We call it a comedy of errors. Have you ever heard this sound, the phrase, water is a right? Yes, water is a right. And it's a consumer right, which the utility companies don't seem to understand. Tonight, it is my honor to present as a consumer. The Consumer Protection Act, it does apply to utility companies. Yes, it does. But do they actually know that? Tonight, we're going to address some common concerns of consumers, unfair treatment, unfair practices, and poor service. We just had a little idea as to the scope of some challenges. So the next slide, Mr. Zoom Master, can you assist me? Is he there? Ignorance is bliss, especially for utility suppliers. Ignorance, there is no defense. Consumer protection is applicable to utility companies. Consumer Protection Act, yes, it applies to suppliers, but they act as if it doesn't exist. They're defined as a business under the consumer legislation, and every single one of us is a customer, a consumer within the definition of your own acts. Consumers are unaware of their rights. So there's a lack of awareness, the right to select your supplier, the right to a delivery of a service. We also have this issue with binding products and forces, whereby you have to take a bundled telecoms package. The right to information, and some companies do take advantage of the ignorance of the poor level of service. And we don't want to call it exploitation. If you can find another word for it, great. But that's what it boils down to. Companies take advantage of our ignorance. On the next slide, yes, it's a monopoly. And monopoly is not just a board game when it comes to utilities. It's actually what happens. We also get with that restrictive trade practices. So you do not have a right to select a supplier. No, because you only have one person doing it, or one entity. Termination of contracts. If you don't want your water company, where are you going? There is no other way. And sometimes a lot of companies, utility companies, make it very difficult for you to exit, particularly the telecoms industry. There's a lack of competition. Where else can you run when it all goes bad? Consumers are trapped by just one provider. And also, if you can go back, slide 3. Slide 3. Yes, the price control. If somebody is controlling the price, it means that there's less efficiency. And also the information on rates, the calculations, it's all down to one supplier. So those are some of the challenges when you have a monopoly. I'm going to take questions at the end, so just hold it. But if there's anything burning, by all means, put it in the chat, and my chat monitor, Brenda, can let me know at the end. So moving on. Yeah, if we can take questions at the end, let me get through this, and then we are gonna go for it. Disconnection, we call it the disconnection dance, 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And we have some challenges here. No notice. Suddenly is disconnection. Suddenly there's no electricity. Suddenly, there's no water and there is no notice. Disconnections happen without the adequate due process to let people know they're going to be disconnected. And that happened to me this year or last year, where I was just suddenly disconnected and my bill was $250. And the funny thing is, I was still paying them when they disconnected me. I had no water, but I was still paying because they say that I hadn't paid something for 3 months, so there was an old bill. So this type of policy is what we're trying to highlight. The lack of due process, no opportunity to address the issues. And as consumers, you're entitled to have a call, a text, an email to tell you that you may be disconnected. You're a consumer. The Consumer Protection Act actually has now a broad outline for the right to information, clear, accurate policies, terms and conditions. For example, you're disconnected by your water company, and it's after they disconnect you that they tell you that it's $100 to reconnect you. Oh no, that $100 should be in the terms of conditions. It should be on your website. And I know in Jamaica, they have all these terms and conditions on the website. Well done, Jamaica. We need to do some due process in the OECS region. Documents a disconnection policy. So your reconnection is a challenge as well. There's no clear communication, advance notice, and billing disputes. Where do you run? There should be a resolution process. Next slide. Next slide. We stop, you pay, and that is the ultimate magic trick. Your service is disconnected, or they have frequent outages and there is just no compensation. They actually demand payment when they are disrupting the service. Have you ever had a bill where they had this $25 service charge and they have not supplied you with continuous service? There's also no refunds, difficulty in obtaining reimbursements, particularly with the telecoms industry. Only in the world of utilities can you pay for something you have not actually received. Can you imagine walking into a restaurant, ordering a steak, and it doesn't come and you still have to pay for it? The standard charge is all about an imaginary service. The next slide. The next slide, we look at unfair and unjust transactions. Transactions that keep you awake at night as a consumers. Consumers are often left paying for services they just didn't get. The charges they do not understand. Unexpected charges, and all in fine print. Unfair, unjust transactions are just frustrating for us as consumers. And the Consumer Protection Act in your country outlines what they call unjust transactions, but nobody has actually tested it. No. Have you had a phone where your top-up just disappears? Or have you had a one-sided contract whereby they penalize you for late payment by a day, but there's no compensation if they shut you off or they don't provide a service? Backdated increases. Sometimes the phone companies in particular, they increase the rates secretly. You go to pay and they tell you, oh, that went up last month. Have you ever had that scenario? And there's no clear explanation. There's no advance notice. Next slide. Enforcement. Well, maybe it might be. They say justice is blind. Well, weak regulations are. Most of the utility companies have outdated policies or acts that go way back into the 50s. How many of them have implemented the Consumer Protection Act in their old legislation? And when it comes to utility companies, justice is definitely on vacation for some of us. Why? Because they have understaffed agencies, insufficient resources to properly enforce. And that goes to the regulator as well. This is what's known as unconscionable conduct, knowing very little and making very little effort to assist, if we can go back, assist with complaints handling. And one of the issues, I want you to take this away, minimum consequences. So even if they breach the Consumer Protection Act, there is no appeal process. There is a severe lack of enforcement when it comes to regulating utility companies. You go to the regulator and you wonder whose side they're on. Next slide. So the invisible contract, it's all about outdated agreements, no written contracts at all. When last did you get a telecoms contract for your phone? Changing conditions that they don't update you on. They change the plan package and you're not aware. And the impact, it's unclear. The terms are unclear. There's no way to dispute that service. And it leads to a lot of confusion about what you actually bought. I'm sure the last time consumers were given updated contracts, there must have been dinosaurs roaming the earth, because I can't remember the last time I had an updated telecoms conditions. When the last did you have one? Next slide. Poor complaints procedures is the last one I want you to take away. It's a black hole. There are long waiting times, hours on hold for customer service. Anybody had that one? Confusing process. You're not sure where you're going. Have you ever tried to file a complaint against a utility company, a water company, or an electricity company? It's just yelling into a void hole. Not only do you have a long waiting time, it's very confusing. I remember my water company, and I'm definitely putting them on hold here. They say you can call, you can email, you can fill a form in. Yes, but when you actually complain, they make you fill one form, then another form. So they're not actually helping you to complain because they don't want any complaints. There's no reporting on how many complaints they've had. There's nothing on their website to say what they're doing. Ignore the issues, example, compliance with the Consumer Protection Act, because they say, oh, it doesn't apply to us. And the last slide. The last slide, where do we go from here? It's now time for consumers to turn the tables. We need to have a regulatory review, demand compliance with the Consumer Protection Act for all utility companies, and they themselves have to educate their lawyers, because it's amazing how many utility lawyers have no idea about the Consumer Protection Act. I've tested that. Updated policies. We want to demand a disconnection policy, and also complaints procedures should be online and there for everybody to see. If you turn on the back of your WASCO bill, you can complain to the regulator. There's nowhere else. Can you imagine? There's nobody to take your complaint on the back of your bill. Go and have a look at the back of your WASCO bill. It says complain to your regulator because they're not interested, basically. So legal enforcement is what we need to try and do. And the last slide, summing up, is that the last one? We need to work together to make sure that the next time it's not just about disconnecting people and poor notice. We ensure that our rights as consumers are respected and that we have a voice. A well-informed consumer is a very powerful consumer. We need regulators to review the Consumer Protection Act. We need a code of practice amongst all the regulators, disconnection policies, and put the service back into consumer service. I thank you as a humble consumer. Okay, so I don't know, anybody has any quick thoughts about that? We are going to have a panel discussion next. And but is there any burning questions that you may have on the outline of the consumer's perspective? No? Okay. In that case, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ayana, to move us forward in terms of the discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for that presentation. Very thorough, and I was taking some notes. Good night, everybody. Welcome. I know that we're all from different parts here, but we're all here together in the interest of consumer power. So tonight I have been asked to chair a discussion, a panel discussion, and we have two heavyweights with us. We have Anthony, who's going to escort me to the utilities company when I go to protest. He has a degree in mechanical engineering and over 30 years of experience as a construction manager. He has built a distinguished career in overseeing large-scale infrastructure projects. His academic background includes an MBA with a specialization in project management and a minor in economics, which provides us a strong foundation for managing complex projects across multiple industries. His construction experience spans several important sectors. In marine construction, he has served as a project manager, a project engineer, leading the construction of a cruise ship berthing facility and overseeing the expansion of a commercial deep water harbor. This included developing a jetty, expanding container storage areas, and a seawall protection system to enhance operational efficiency and safety. In the water system sector, he has managed projects involving the design and construction of comprehensive water treatment and distribution networks. One such project involved developing a plant that produces drinking water by treating brackish water through ultrafiltration and reverse osmosis. He has also led the design and construction of entire water systems, from intake structures and pipelines to storage reservoirs, and his expertise extends to procurement, installation, commissioning of water bottling plants. He also has experience in manufacturing, including roles as a mechanical engineer and capital projects manager, where he has been responsible for constructing manufacturing facilities, including power plants, raw material storage units, production lines, as well as warehouses. As a maintenance manager, he oversaw the upkeep of equipment and the setup of production lines, and he has also played the role of an environmental manager, ensuring compliance with regulations related to storage, discharge, emissions, and so on. He has been responsible for employment safety and health protocols. In construction, Anthony has managed projects involving residential buildings, major capital developments, and so on. Michael Diamond is an attorney at law, admitted to the bar in New York State, and he is a former commissioner on the CARICOM Review Commission at the Office of the Prime Minister. He's a president and chief executive officer of Consumers Intervention of Jamaica, CIJ, which is a private not-for-profit advocacy group that represents consumer rights in key areas and is a strong proponent for front-of-package warning labels. The CIJ provides government, businesses, and other organizations with the consumer's perspective on concerns including consumer protection, data privacy, food safety, and nutritional labeling information, as well as access to healthy alternatives. In terms of his training, he is a graduate of New York University and Yale Law School, and he holds a bachelor's in psychology and a JD. Since returning to Jamaica in 2014, Michael has become a prominent figure in consumer rights advocacy in Jamaica. And with his staunch track record advocating for the consumers of Jamaica, he has served on several boards, regionally and internationally, private and public. He has served as strategic advisor to the National Financial Inclusion Council under the National Financial Inclusion Strategy. So he has 25 years or more than 25 years of experience in the legal profession, and he holds the distinguished position of having been the youngest past president-elect of the oldest non-government consumer protection organization in the region, which is the National Consumers League of Jamaica. He's also served on the board of directors for Healthy Caribbean Coalition and the Jamaica Customer Service Association. We would like to welcome both of these panelists to our session tonight, our ICAN session, and start the ball rolling. I am Ayana Young-Marshall, and I am a lecturer in consumer protection, business law, and so on at the Sagicor Cahill School of Business and Management in Barbados. So we have many questions that we want to ask, but in the interest of time, we're going to get straight into it. And we want to hear from our experts how we are going to untangle this web of consumer power and the challenges that you've just heard Anne-Marie identify in her presentation a few seconds ago. So I want to ask, in terms of what's your reaction to the panel when you hear the words, "I'd like to file a utility complaint"? Now, this was intended for a regulator, but from the point of view, yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
Right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It made me feel a little tired listening to everything that I did. Maybe
We have to give you credit. If you're a heavyweight,
maybe it's
you're a
time that I
heavyweight.
retire, right? And then you said I'm the lecturer in whatever, and so on, right? But no, thank you for that, and good evening to my fellow panelists and the audience as well. And I thank you to ICAN for putting together this wonderful forum. It really is a requirement in our society because of our history. We are not the people who understand how to challenge authority and our rights. We came from society in our recent history that were enslaved people, and any challenge to authority was met with very harsh and brutal punishment. And because of that, the society that we still exist in still a little bit timid to challenge authority. And so forums like this are extremely beneficial to educate ourselves, as Anne-Marie said, to know that you have a right and that you have a right to file a complaint. And so when I hear somebody say, yeah, good evening, I am here to file a complaint, I'm like, yes, that is one person who understands that they do have a right, and they have a right to demand good service without expecting retributions, without expecting poor service, and to understand that utility company exists because the consumer pays their bills. They exist because the consumer consumes what they produce. They don't produce it for themselves. They produce it for the consumer. And so that is my reaction. I would like to see more of that happen, because that is one of the institutions that we have that can hold utility companies honest and to demand. They say people respect what you inspect. And so if a utility company knows that they have a group of consumers who expect them to provide good service, who expect them to provide quality service, who expect them to apologize when there's an interruption to the service that they pay for, I think everybody would benefit, because utility company would know that I have to put my best foot forward. Otherwise, there are going to be consequences.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I see that Michael has put in the chat a reminder of the principles surrounding consumer protection. Michael, I wanted to ask you a different question, though. I wanted to ask you, given your practice and given your experience, what are the most common complaints you have heard from consumers about utility companies? And how, in your experience, have they been addressed, whether from a legal standpoint or before it became crystallized into legal consequences?
Okay, very interestingly enough, those questions that were asked in the beginning regarding which would you give up, a shower or the internet? The common complaint is always the fact that the consumer feels a bit helpless, unfortunately, because the utilities are usually dealing with a necessity that we need, our basic necessities, especially where the water and electricity are concerned. And the complaints that they would have is just that they may not have been clear information regarding the terms and conditions of their account or the contract that they have with utilities. And also, of course, the unpredictability of the bills that they receive on a monthly basis when they do receive a bill. And also, of course, the disconnection without proper notice. The fact of the matter is that in Jamaica, addressing some of those issues wasn't just simply a policy issue, but over the consistency of, consumer advocates advocating that, guess what? We need to have something in place to hold utilities accountable, notwithstanding a natural disaster. But when we have guaranteed standards that were put in place to say that these are basic delivery items that a consumer must be guaranteed, and when these guarantees are not met, then there should be some financial penalty towards the utility companies. It has worked. It has worked well, yes. The issue comes down to, again, for those who do not know their rights and they may not know how, to apply to have these penalties, how to have these penalties addressed where they're concerned. So what has happened now, the regulator went to automatic payments, an automatic system that you, the consumer, doesn't have to, be able to file a complaint. These things are automatic. Once the system registers that there's a breach, then it's automatically applied to the consumer's account. So consumers don't have to go through a process of, applying for those penalties. So that helped a lot. Now, where there can be certain improvements, we definitely need a strong advocacy or consumer protection framework that is not just on paper, but is also in practice. We do need to get, customers, and I say customers because, here in Jamaica, and of course in the region, there's a distinction between a customer and a consumer. A customer is one who is actually paying for the service. A consumer is an individual who's utilizing that service, whether he's paying or not. So what the utility companies do is that they would say that the unpredictability of your bill is because we have individuals who are breaching and are stealing the resource and they're not paying their fair share of it. So you, the paying customer, have to flip that bill. So there's a thing required to see if we can get some change behavior where individuals need to know that this is not just a luxury, but it's an actual necessity. This is a resource that it cannot be squandered, because producing electricity or making water delivered to you at your home, at your dwelling, where you turn a tap and here's water flowing from it, there's a lot that goes into making that possible. And until we get, what I say, a level of education, information, sensitization to get individuals to support the delivery of service and the utilities, then there's going to be a lot more abuses that would appear, because again, those utilizing the service, they don't know what goes into it. And the utility companies, of course, they're in it to make a profit. So the fact that you're here to make a profit is not the easiest thing to do when, you have individuals complaining where you have to pay out monies to them, or you have to deliver services to those who happens to be in an area that is not beneficial for the company. So if you don't have a framework of consumer protection or government policies that are willing to hold individuals accountable regardless, then the consumer will always be holding the bag and the utilities will always be the giant. And that feeling of a lack of empowerment is what motivates individuals. I won't necessarily call names, but it motivates individuals to go and visit locations with cutlasses that, the cutlass is supposed to be the advocate that would get the necessary redress. Unfortunately, here's other things that come into play. But ultimately, having a good policy, having good government accountability, having a strong consumer protection framework, and a system where complaints are readily addressed. Here in Jamaica also, the consumer protection body has triggers in place for when a complaint is received and how long before it can be actioned. So most complaints received are actioned within 48 hours. And there is a policy where you can actually check to basically see the status of your complaint. But nothing is just taken and just held, willy-nilly. So that has also contributed to having redress in a timely manner, because one of the complaints from consumers had to do with not being able to get redress in a timely manner where they can go on with their lives. So that is something that others within the region can also look to implement, that there has to be a mechanism that would treat with complaints in such a manner that in the event that it needs to go to the next step, where it got to go to arbitration, where it has to go to court, that at least that individual can be prepared for that in a timely fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And Jamaica certainly provides a yardstick that the rest of us can use in terms of that holding the foot to the fire of utilities companies. But as Anne-Marie mentioned in her presentation a little while ago, there's that dilemma of the monopoly status of the utility. And so the question that I wanted to bounce back to Anthony, I'm going to kind of bounce between the two of you, is how do we handle those cases of powerlessness when it comes to the consumer versus that monopolistic utility provider, when especially, in many cases, they are considered major investors in the economy and so on, and they have a kind of ordained position as far as our governments are concerned. What strategies have you been able to use to advocate for change against this, in the context of this kind of David Goliath situation?
Well, in response to that, obviously, the media has to play a very important role, because you have an individual, a utility company that has tens of thousands of customers, and then one person stands up and says, "You are not being fair to me." And they say, "So what? What are you going to do about it?" And that person can feel very helpless, because the utility company is powerful. Sometimes they might have an in-house legal person, or they have attorneys on retainer. A lot of times in the Caribbean, let's face it, a few people, our circles are small. So sometimes utility company managers, and so they rub shoulders with the regulators. They go to the same cocktails, they travel together, they attend the same meetings, they may sit on boards of other companies, the banks and so on together. They may have gone to university together. There are all kinds of ways in which these folks run in that same circle, because it's a tight circle. And so a consumer can feel really helpless. But there's this one magic silver bullet. All utilities are afraid of bad press. All utilities are afraid of bad press. And so the media has to step in and be that, what do you want to say, maybe that arbiter, that person, that body, that institution that can empower an individual. And especially now, where the internet has sort of decentralized the ability to disseminate information, that we have grassroots influencers who have tens of thousands of followers, and we can just call that person and they come and they do a video, and the utility company is embarrassed. Luckily, we still exist in an era where people feel, I don't know if that they feel shame, but it is connected to their bottom line. because no matter what, they're trying to put a good face on it. And so any kind of complaint like that requires them to make a response. And so when a general manager or somebody of a utility company gets called and say, what about this person up in the country that you send a bill? He has one pipe in his yard and one bathroom, and you send him a bill for $5,000, and you guys still disconnected him, knowing that most likely his bill is, and he starts to stammer and stutter because he doesn't have an answer. The utility companies are still afraid of that. And so as consumer advocates, we have to make friends with the media. And we have to educate, as Anne-Marie say, an informed consumer is, or I'm putting a paraphrase, but an informed consumer is the worst nightmare of a utility company who doesn't respect consumer rights. And so that is it. I mean, unless you are a consumer who has access to an attorney, if you exist in a society where there are some sort of pro bono legal services that you can get someone to represent you for little or no cost, your best bet is the media. And that's what we have to look at. And but we have to educate our consumers to keep good records. Don't throw any correspondence away. But not only that, complain in writing. Have your child send an email instead of making a phone call. You can make a phone call, but also send an email, because that creates a record. We have to be able to understand that if it comes to that, we have to be able to produce evidence that we communicated, and we have to produce evidence of all the efforts that we made. And so the education of our consumers, to let them know that even if you think it's trivial, keep a record. If you go to a utility company and you paid in cash, make sure you get a receipt and you keep your receipt. All of those things that we just take for granted, because you put the receipt in your pocket, it gets crumbled, you come to the laundry, you toss it away. And then you have an issue a year later or 2 years later where you get something that says that you're in arrears and you don't have your receipt to prove that you paid. And you go to the utility company and you say, can I get a printout of my history of my account? And they tell you, oh, we don't have it, it's in the archive, you have to send a letter to request it, and they turn you around. So it's just easier if you have your own records. So that's what we have to do. We have to get our consumers to be forearmed and forewarned. Keep your communication with a trail, an email, in writing. Even if you went there in person, have a notebook that you make a note. On the 30th of January 2025, I visited the water company and I met with Miss so-and-so, and I told her that so-and-so and so happened. Make a note of that and keep it, so that you may never need it, but if you do need it, you have it. Find out who you can call in terms of social media, and those are the tools that we have that can help us defend ourselves against a seemingly Goliath.
Thank you very much. That's almost a checklist that we can keep to ensure that we are, we defend our rights. Thank you very much, Anthony. Michael, I wanted to bounce back on the issue of trust, and whether, so coming from that whole discussion as to the variance in power between the David and the Goliath, how can that trust ever be rebuilt between the utility company and the consumer? Or is that a pipe dream? Is that an impossible dream? And what has been your experience as well in Jamaica?
Hey, well, I can certainly say that it is human nature not to trust anything that has semblance of government or the fact of utilities. The challenge that many jurisdictions have is that some of these utility companies are actually foreign owned, as far as they may have a majority of the shares. For example, here in Jamaica, the power company is 40% Japanese, 40% Korean, and 20% to the government. Now, of course, that creates a challenge that you have, a foreign entity that is responsible for your production of electricity. When it comes to the monopoly, the challenge is that economies of scale. Many of the Caribbean countries have, they have a very small population. So when you think of Jamaica that has, an estimated population of 3 million individuals, there's not enough space for power companies to be in to give consumers that, choice, which can drive competition, which will lower prices. So what you do have is that there's going to be semblance of a monopoly, and there are things that they do to basically skirt that definition legally. So you have power producers, independent power producers, that they produces the power and then they sell it over to the main company. So because of that, they say we're not a monopoly. We are just responsible for the distribution of power, and we do not control the production of it. Now, that, because many consumers don't have that information, there's always going to be that lack of trust, transparency in how billing is basically generated. That creates a level of, distrust. And again, utilities require certain license and permits. The thing about government corruption is always something that hangs over their head, and the consumer believes that because of corruption, the government allows them to continue this type of practice. Now, interestingly enough, everything that Anthony says is what a learned, informed, and a disciplined consumer is supposed to do. You're supposed to keep records. You're supposed to document any interactions that you have with utility companies and anyone you do business with, because accountability is very important when it comes time for you to file a formal complaint. Now, he who has the best records will win most of the time. So what we have here is, in order for us to or get to a level of trust, no one will ever trust a utility company. But what they will trust is if, in fact, the government or the regulator continue to be consistent, and there continue to be transparency in how they treat with the utility companies. When there is an approval given, there's transparency to say what grounds that approval was issued, and they must not be afraid to revoke license to operate as well. This is where consumer trust is built, when they can actually see that the regulator and the government are actively doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they were elected to do. Oftentimes, that is skirted, and that is what creates the mistrust. When you have utility companies that can send you a bill that has, double what you have last month, and those who work there cannot give you a reasonable explanation, though one does exist, but is not communicated effectively, it can also create a level of distrust. Now, you're going to turn as a consumer to the regulator to say, hey, here it is. I have a bill that was doubled what I paid last month, and I certainly didn't do any activities that would have increased it. Why is this so? There are many factors that contribute to a bill that would exceed, your previous bill. But if it is not communicated properly, then of course, another, barrier to trust that exists. Will there ever be trust between utility and consumer? No. What we also have to be realistic is that a lot of times, until we begin to learn how to reduce our dependency on electricity, reduce our dependency on water, be more resourceful, we need to learn how to conserve. This is very important, because it's our over dependency on these resources that allows a lot of these companies to take advantage of us. So we have to get to that point where we do have some change behavior that will look more towards conservation rather than simply consumption. And this is something that can drive prices down when they see that individuals are no longer having this large
Dependent.
demand,
Yeah.
so they'll now have to attempt to do things to get you on board. Utility companies love the holidays. Christmas just passed. They were, they're in the red again. So it's a situation where consumer education is very important. So we don't want a level of trust. What we truly want is a change behavior that will allow us not to be so dependent upon utility companies. There's an expression that says, he who has the power to feed you also has a power to starve you. And when we look at utilities, is that once we become so dependent upon these resources, again, even though it's a necessity, we can be very conservative in how we utilize it. And there will give us that reduction that we're looking for, that won't give them, they will have very little excuses for why we have this large bill when we're conserving. What
Yeah.
alternatives have we turned to? How are we advocating to the government, to force the production of alternatives and to basically create an environment that, we'll start using alternative sources of energy so that we don't have to be dependent upon, electricity in that
Thank
form. So
you. Thank you
that's
very much,
basically where we are.
Michael. Yeah, so consumer advocacy takes a different form from how many have traditionally thought about it. It takes a sort of economic empowerment and information about opportunities to diversify away from the product that the utility company or the service is offering. We have ICAN, and Anne-Marie wants us to do a few scenario-based questions for listeners that might actually be in a dilemma. So I want to ask two before we briefly, because I am kept to time, open for any other questions from anybody else. But I wanted to ask you to bounce back to Anthony in a scenario, in a real life scenario where a consumer suspects that their meter is malfunctioning, but on approaching the utility company, they've had their claim dismissed. What should they do? What steps should they take? Can you give us another checklist similar to the one that you gave us before as to what they should do?
All right. So first of all, I want to say that this meeting was taking place, and it started with me having no electricity, and power just came back on. And so, unplanned, unannounced, unexplained power outage, and it came back. So as Michael was just saying, what can you do? Luckily, because I planned to do this forum from my computer, but I had to do it from my phone. I had a candle and a flashlight. That's what I was getting lights from. Yeah. But the question that you ask is, if you have a faulty meter, what can you, and the company denies.
Well, you don't know, you're not sure,
But you
right? They suspect, the layperson, the consumer suspects that, but the experts are arguing dismissing that claim. What
Right.
steps can you take?
And so what I would say is that if it's an electric meter, we have to be careful, because any kind of interference around that service can result in injury or even death. And so if it's an electric meter and you suspect that it is running without it was recording truly, one of the things that you can do is to turn off everything that consumes power. Turn off everything that consumes power, let's say for an hour and a half. You could just hit your main switch, so there's no power coming in. Record the time and go to the power company and ask them, during that period of time, did you see that there was no power being consumed? The other thing you can do is, if you know an electrician, you can ask an electrician to come in, a licensed electrician to come in and to examine their consumption of power during that period and compare it to what your meter read during that time. You can do a power audit where someone comes in and they can the equipment that you have. You can get the specifications, so somebody who's technically knowledgeable can calculate pretty closely what your consumption should be, because they would know the wattage of your fridge, of your stove, of your lights, and so on. and calculate what it should be over a period of time, and you can compare it to what the utility company is saying. So consultation. If it's electricity and you're not a qualified electrician, don't go put a screwdriver, don't do that sort of thing. The things that you can do is maybe stop consuming power and go to the electric company and ask them for that period of time that you know for sure it was turned off. And you can even, everybody has a phone, you can take a video of that time, do a timestamp, and you can consult an expert. You can do similar things with your water meter as well. Also, you can take a video of how fast the needle on your meter is spinning. If you have the one with a dial, and go take one with your neighbor and show that yours is spinning so much faster than your neighbor's. That is kind of rough, but it again gives you something to argue with. You can do that for your water meter. You can do that for your electric bill. Also, you may also don't just assume that there's something nefarious going at the water company. Do a little audit of your home and see that you have like your toilet is not constantly running, and therefore that's why you're consuming more water than you should. Did you buy a new appliance? Did you have a transformer that you normally would turn off, but you left it on? Because transformers consume power whether you're using what it is connected to or not. So just do a little bit of your own audit and try to see if you can verify what the company is saying. So that's what you're stuck with. Try to record your habits during a period of time, compare it to what the company has as a reading, and then you can say that those records don't jive. The other thing that you can do is make a formal request to your utility company to calibrate your meter. Okay, so the utility company can come in and test your meter. If it's water, they can know, they can a fixed volume of water flowing through your meter and see what the meter registers and see if they jive. Same thing for electricity. They can test it, and so you can request a formal recalibration of your meter from the utility company. So they have to send somebody out to do that.
Thank you very much. This is really an arsenal that ICAN is helping through you to provide for consumers. The final question I wanted to ask to you, Michael, and I know that I am running out of time, has to do with compensation. So where there has been a scenario where there's a prolonged service disruption, should utility companies automatically compensate consumers that are affected? And if you think yes, that they should, what is a fair way to calculate that compensation? You want me to give it again?
Yes, run it by me again.
Run it again. Right. So in a scenario where there has been a prolonged service disruption, we're asking you whether you think that utility companies should automatically compensate consumers that have been affected. And if you think yes, what do you think is a fair way to calculate such compensation?
Wow. Interestingly enough, most consumers would agree to say yes. If you've had for an extended period of time, there should be some level of compensation. Keeping in mind, here in Jamaica, there is such a policy that once it goes over a certain amount of hours or days, then yes, the consumer is entitled to compensation. Identifying what is fair compensation has a lot to do with what their particular consumption or their last 2 months' bills would look like, and they would attempt to find an average. Now, here's the challenge. Are we given cash compensation or are we given utility credits? So that is something that, of course, utility companies can utilize, because given the credits, you may be able to give more credits that can satisfy that consumer rather than, a meager financial compensation that truly doesn't make a dent. So yes, for an extended period of time, depending on what the situation is, because we have to be fair and balanced here, that it cannot be a situation that technically was outside of the control of the utility company. You know, we don't want to just compensate where there was an impossibility on one end. So that is also something that has to be carefully, monitored. But definitely, yes, once they're an extended period of time, you cannot expect a customer to continue to be without the service and yet still, be required, to make payment. So yes, of course, the as you asked, what would be fair? Again, I lean more towards credit towards the service rather than a financial compensation, because the credits I would imagine can be higher.
Thank you very much. I was neglecting to check in with the chat, and Sapphire said yes, that David stoned Goliath, so there is hope, consumer power. And Anne-Marie also reminded us that she also had a power outage on her road, and she was wondering whether it was a coincidence. We were asking if there were any other questions at this stage from others in the meeting, and obviously, this session is going to be publicized beyond today, so there might be questions that people might have. So please feel free at this time, as I have just moments left, because we still have some richness coming after this. If there are any other questions that folks want to pose to the panel. Otherwise, I'm going to hand back over to you, Chair Anne-Marie. Thank you very much.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes. Is there anybody who has a burning question for our panelists? I'm sure there's something at the back of your mind. We now have a couple of minutes.
Sorry, Anne-Marie. Elroy has asked a question. Are class action lawsuits an effective way to hold companies accountable? I suppose, Michael?
Interestingly enough, is that, class actions are not automatic, nor are they possible in all jurisdictions. Not every jurisdiction have class action laws that will allow that to take place. And the challenge also is getting the court to certify a case as being qualified for class action. Yes, in the event where it exists, where class action is available, it can, depending on the level of compensation that is being sought. But certainly class action can allow to address a situation where there are many customers affected by that particular situation or, grievance. So yes, class action is definitely an effective way. So that's also something that can be advocated for in regions and in countries that is not, that the government does create they do create that tool that consumers can utilize. In situations where there's a lot of influence by large companies and high corruption, then class action is not something they're looking to implement. They don't want to have class action laws because, of course, that is the multiple voice in one case that can definitely put a dent in their pockets. So yes, for while it's effective, it is not available in many jurisdictions, and that's one of the things that consumers can and constituencies can advocate to their representative for, that there should be class action when it comes down to utility companies.
Thanks, Michael. Over to you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for allowing me to be here with you. Over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Well, there's food for thought. And I'm sure we could have another hour or two with these distinguished gentlemen, but you know what? Everything has to come to an end. However, this is not the end of ICAN. We do these presentations every 2 months, and we're going to invite both gentlemen back to tackle another issue. The next area is banking. Yes, banking. So in 2 months' time, we'll be back with that. I want to ask if there's any further questions in the audience for any of our panelists or even me during my presentation. Anything you want to say before we end the meeting? This is your opportunity. Two very distinguished gentlemen. They don't come to St. Lucia very often. via the internet. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Any more questions? God, you're a shy lot. But I'm going to take their phone numbers and we're going to bombard them afterwards. I now turn to my colleague just to do a little reflection on what we've done today. Anthony, over to you in terms of a summary of the things that we need to take away. Is he here?
Anthony Scotland, right?
Anthony Scotland?
Elroy.
No, Anthony said he was up for it. So we just want to know if he's still here. Okay. All right. While he gets his papers in order, I guess there is room to ask one question, and this was a burning one for me. Let me just try and find my notes. One thing that I wanted to focus on was independent consumer protection bodies in every OECS states. Now, for me, this is a priority. What do you say about independence of the consumer protection bodies, and how is that prioritized? How much priority should we give to that? Is there anything you want to add to that question? Any thoughts?
Yes, definitely. I would say that it is in the Treaty of Chaguaramas that there should be independent consumer protection bodies. The fact of the matter is, the attractiveness is that it will not be, it is free of political interference, so where the consumer's interests would be the priority of those organizations. And we are supposed to prioritize establishing these organizations, associations within the region, simply for the fact that the independent nature of it is where true protection can come from, rather than, having bodies that are politically influenced, where individuals are politically appointed, aligned with certain agenda. Because if you have a government that is pushing for, commercialization, consumer protection doesn't fit well into that. So we have to have that independence that will allow protection. And to have a balance, yes, but we must always remember there has to be life over profits. We cannot put profits over the lives of our people. So having that level of independence, just like having the sovereignty to be able to, have your own country, and, you live and have rules that basically align with your own people, is very important. So having that independent consumer protection body is something that we should prioritize if we want true consumer protection.
Thank you. It's just how to do it, because at the end of the day, the consumer bodies are part of the government. Don't shoot me. That's the message I'm getting. They're part of the government, but they still have to be independent. Very, very thin line.
So what happened is that, yes, they do have agencies that would be a part of the government, but the Treaty of Chaguaramas also speak to those NGO consumer protection that would be given the same level of authority without the interference of government, because your only protection cannot be government, simply because the government cannot sue itself. So because of that, there isn't a true consumer protection if only the government is the one responsible for that. So that's the reason why it was included in the treaty. And we do have, that to go to. So in the event that you have a government or individuals that are resisting that, they can be held accountable for violating the treaty where that part is concerned.
Anything else you want to add, Anthony, before we close this session? And we do want to find Anthony. Probably nipped off to the toilet, but
yeah.
Any closing remarks?
So this is Anthony Drigo. Actually, one of the things I want to say is that consumers have to understand that most of the time they own the resources that the utility company is using to make a profit from. Like in Dominica, where we have so much water, we have a water company. The water resources is supposed to belong to the people. And the utility company, water company, has to realize that it's a privilege that they have to be able to use that resource. Yes, by marshalling that resource and controlling it, they're providing a service for which they and their shareholders expect to be rewarded. But they have to understand that what the thing that they are selling originally belonged to the people. Similarly, in countries like Dominica, again, where you have hydroelectricity, or you may have telephone companies that use the wavelengths, it's in the air, that also, those things also belong to the people. The electric company, even if they're mostly run on diesel, they use public land for their poles and to run their wires and that sort of thing. So a lot of the time, it should really work as a partnership between the citizens of a country who own the resources, or a significant part of it, and the utility company that's investing in putting those resources into a usable manner. And so having independent consumer protection agency should really be formed from that perspective, that body is sitting in between the owners of the resource, which are the people, and the service company that is putting it in a format where it can be utilized. And if we approach it from that point of view, and we educate folks on that, then we probably will get a relationship where there is the respect, the mutual respect from both sides. And maybe we don't have trust, but we will have a mutual respect that would make it happen, where everybody benefits from a good quality of service, and the shareholders benefit from getting a good return on their investment. The employees enjoy employment with the utility company that gives them a decent wage. And we have to be able to move into that direction to empower folks, to let them understand that you're not helpless in this scenario, because the resources that these people are using are yours to begin with.
Hey, lovely. The resources are yours. We're going to move to the vote of thanks, just to say, farewell, goodbye. And if I can ask Asha to come to the podium, the virtual lecture.
Hi, good night, everyone. Okay, I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to the esteemed presenters for the insightful and thought-provoking contributions to tonight's training. Your expertise, your knowledge, and your passion for consumer advocacy have been truly inspiring, and you not only provided us with valuable tools and resources, but you've also sparked meaningful discussions that will help us to further our work in empowering consumers and promoting their rights. We are grateful for your time and effort, for the time and effort you have put into preparing and delivering tonight's session, your explanation and your practical examples and also has made this topic more accessible. And we are leaving here with a wealth of knowledge that can apply to our own advocacy work. So to the presenters, thank you for sharing your expertise, for your commitment to creating a better consumer environment. We look forward to continuing this journey of advocacy together. And we hope to see all of you again in future sessions. Once again, thank you for being a part of this training and for helping us build a stronger network of consumer advocates. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for organizing such a wonderful forum. Let's see if we can grow it to where we have tremendous audience, because there's so many people who can benefit from what we discussed tonight.
It will be available on YouTube, and I will send a recording for those who miss the start of the presentation. Okay. On that note, we're going to say good night. We'll be back in 2 months' time, Consumer Rights Month. So we'll do something on that theme. Thank you again. And to our esteemed gentlemen, thank you. See you next time.